There's a specific kind of exhaustion that comes from living online. It's not just tiredness, it's something more like complexity. Complexity fatigue. Between who you are and who you've made yourself look like. Between what you actually feel and what you perform. Between the version of yourself that shows up in pictures and the version that wakes up at 3 a.m. and can't quite locate itself. A philosopher named Andrea Hiott has a phrase for the atmosphere we're all swimming in right now. She calls it the complexity of optics. The constant flood of information, image, performance, noise, all of it promising to give you the solution to your discomfort even as it generates more of it. And she contrasts it with something she calls the complexity of love. Not love as sentiment, not love as a feeling you have when things are going well. Love as something much harder and more fundamental. Love as the actual ground of what you are. So we are sharing her work with you here. Created from her public writing and her books and her love and philosophy project and waymaking. But we're not going to get there through abstraction. We're going to get there through two stories. One about a man who walked on the moon. One about a woman who walked into a factory. And what both of them discovered when the thing they were reaching for turned out not to be what they needed. Part 1, Magnificent Desolation, What Happens When You Get There. July 20th, 1969. Neil Armstrong steps onto the lunar surface. The world is watching, and right behind him is Buzz Aldrin, the second human being to ever walk on the moon. From the outside, this is the pinnacle. This is as far as a human being has ever physically gone. Aldrin had given everything to get there. His marriage had strained under the pressure. His mother, a woman whose middle name was Moon, a detail almost too poetic to be real, had died by suicide the year before, overwhelmed in part. Aldrin later said, by the strangeness of watching her son become famous. He had sacrificed what many people sacrifice when they pursue something with total devotion. He was determined to reach the moon, no matter what. And then he got there. He described the lunar surface in one of the most honest phrases any astronaut has ever used. He called it magnificent desolation. Within months of coming back, Aldrin started to fall apart. He writes in his memoir, I wanted to resume my duties, but there were no duties to resume. There was no goal, no sense of calling, no project worth pouring myself into. He spiraled into depression and alcoholism. His marriage ended. He stopped getting out of bed. He was arrested for disorderly conduct. Less than a decade after being celebrated as an American hero, he was selling Cadillacs at a dealership, trying to use his famous name to make a living. Now, why am I telling you this? I'm not telling it as a cautionary tale about fame, though it is that. I'm telling it because Andrea Hiott has a very precise diagnosis for what happened to Buzz Aldrin. And it has nothing to do with astronauts. She calls it the trick of seeing through. It's what happens when you push through a veil, when you achieve something or cross some threshold or go somewhere you'd always imagined. And the reality of it doesn't match the imagination. Not because the thing was bad, but because imagination itself is what you were really craving. And no real experience can ever be imagination itself. Aldrin had spent years building his life toward a single point. Everything he was, everything he valued, was organized around getting to that point. And then he got there, and the kaleidoscope shifted, and suddenly he could see a whole constellation of what he'd been reaching toward, and none of it was where he'd assumed it would be. The point he'd been aiming at was real, but it wasn't the thing he'd actually needed. There's a mirror trap inside this. The more famous Aldrin became, the more the world saw him as Buzz Aldrin, Moonwalker. The more he had to perform being that person. He'd become a cartoon character of himself. And he knew the truth the cartoon was hiding, that he really cared. That he was motivated and held and in need, like any human being. But the image demanded he pretend otherwise. Andrea Hiott says, attention is not care. And in fact, it can keep us from admitting we are motivated, held, and in need. He eventually found his way. Back, but not by achieving another pinnacle. Not by perfecting his image. He found his way back by talking, by writing, by helping others who were struggling with addiction, by reconnecting to the ground, by admitting finally that he needed care, and that no feat, no matter how great, could replace that need. Andrea writes, The more famous we become, the more we seem to think we have to act famous, as if we have all the care we need. But fame is not care. Attention is not care. And life keeps telling us that, one way or another, until we get it. Part 2, Afflicted Transcendence. The opposite direction, the same wall. Now I want to tell you the other story, the counterpoint. Simone Weil placed first in the competitive entrance exams at École Normale Supérieure, one of France's most elite institutions. Simone de Beauvoir placed third. By the time she finished school, Weil was considered by many to be one of the most brilliant philosophical minds in Europe. A prestigious teaching position was waiting for her. She walked away. She wanted to understand affliction, the suffering of working people, the poor, the factory worker, not as an abstract concept, but as lived reality. So in 1934, despite being thin and small and plagued by migraines, she convinced a factory director to hire her at the Alstom factory in France. She wanted to feel what workers felt, not theorize about it from a comfortable distance. After a year, it had broken her in body and soul. She wrote, "That contact with affliction killed my youth. Where Buzz Aldrin climbed to the highest pinnacle and found emptiness, Simone Weil deliberately descended to the lowest point and found also not quite what she was looking for." Her friend Simone de Beauvoir wrote of her, "I envied her for having a heart that could beat round the world, which is one of the most beautiful things anyone has ever said about anyone. But it also points to the problem." Weil kept going further into affliction. She refused to eat more than those on wartime rations. She refused treatment for her tuberculosis. She died of heart failure, partly from self-starvation, at 34. There's a scholar named Elizabeth Hardwick who describes what Weil was doing as reduction by expansion, throwing oneself fully into the place of what needs care outside oneself, as if in contrast to what is bodily and present. As if you can only give care by eliminating yourself as a place where care is needed. Weil understood the paradox at the heart of all this. She wrote and spoke beautifully about attention. True attention, she said, is the rarest and purest form of generosity. It requires what she called a negative effort, not muscular straining, but a receptive emptying. She understood that you have to hollow yourself out to really receive someone else, what she seems not to have turned toward herself. She could not hold that paradox, the care she extended outward toward the world, and the care owed to her own body, her own life. She saw the tension in others as something to dissolve through sacrifice. She didn't see it as something to hold. And yet, even in her extremity, there were moments of what Andrea would recognize as exactly the thing. Weil was once unemployed, waiting outside an employment office with two strangers, a 58-year-old man who liked photography and an 18-year-old who liked to draw. She described what happened as miraculous. Total comradeship. For the first time in my life, really. No barrier at all. Miraculous. Not achieved through greatness. Not through sacrifice. Through shared affliction and its recognition. Through standing together, stripped of pretense. Through care that flowed both ways. Two stories, opposite directions. Aldrin went as high as a human being can go. Will went as low as she could bear. Both discovered that meaning doesn't come from where you stand in the hierarchy of achievement or suffering. Both discovered, one more successfully than the other, that what was really there, at every level, was care. Not care as a feeling. Not care as something you earn or perform or sacrifice for. Something much more foundational than that. Part 3. Care is tension into a new dimension. This is where Andrea Hiott's philosophy begins to do something unusual. Because she doesn't say more care in the way self-help books say it. She's not making a moral argument. She's making a structural one. Andrea Hiott writes, "Not care as sentiment, not care as obligation. This is care as the tension that evidences your relation beyond your thinking. Care as the release that pulls you to the surface of another ocean, another cosmos." Let's slow down on that word, tension. Because in our usual vocabulary, tension is a problem. You relieve tension, you resolve it. You meditate it away or talk it through or win an argument and the tension is gone. Andrea is saying, no, the tension is not a problem to resolve. The tension is the evidence that you're alive, that you're in relation, that you care. Think about what love feels like. Not the Instagram version, the actual experience of loving someone. It's not peaceful, it's frightening in a way, because you can't control it. Andrea writes about feeling as a child that she loved her parents and her brothers so much it felt painful, because she could not guarantee they would always be safe, could not control what happened to them. She had to feel the love and could not be sure she wouldn't lose the object of it. That is the terrible tension. That is the evidence of care. That is why it's so hard to face. Andrea Hiott, love is what we are woven with, and it ain't easy. Now here's the structural claim. She says most of us are living in what she calls either-or thinking, building our identities as much on what we oppose as on what we support. We define ourselves against something, against a political position, against a type of person, against a previous version of ourselves we've decided to reject. And that push, that opposition, gives us a sense of ground. It feels like it's holding us. But she asks, what if you stopped pushing against? What's left to hold you then? Most people, when they first encounter this question, feel a kind of vertigo. Like if they stop pushing, they'll lose their footing entirely. And she says, yes, that vertigo is real. That's what it feels like when the either-or flatland pops out into a multidimensional constellation. Suddenly, there's a whole solar system of possibility where there used to be two poles, and it can feel like you want to go back to hating whatever you've spent so much time pushing against, because at least it was predictable. Andrea Hiott. Many now feel as if they are living in their head, pinpointed behind their eyes, or at the mercy of some pattern of thinking they can't break. We are much more than that voice in the head, more like the context or landscape holding those streams of thought. This is the philosophical move at the center of everything she does. Thinking, that voice in your head, the stream of thoughts, the inner critic, the narrator, is not all of cognition. It's the tip of the iceberg. Beneath it is a vast, ongoing, bodily, distributed process of being alive in the world. And what holds that process? What is the water the iceberg floats in? Andrea Hiott. Care is the water creating that iceberg and holding it. It's also the freezing and the melting. The practice she's describing, which she calls holding paradox, is not a trick for becoming more flexible or more open-minded, though it does that. It's a practice of shifting your attention from your thoughts to what's holding them, from the content of your mind to the context, from the ice to the water. And what you find there is not nothing. What you find there is care. Part 4, Holding Paradox. The portal, not the problem. So what does it actually mean to hold a paradox? Because this is the phrase at the center of Andrea's work, and I think it's easy to misunderstand. It doesn't mean being indecisive. It doesn't mean moral relativism, refusing to take positions, treating everything as equally valid. It doesn't mean passivity. She's very clear on this. Andrea Hiott says, holding paradox is not the same as being paradoxical. There is a big difference, and in cultivating this practice, we get better at noticing it. Source, Threshold, Visioning Love and Philosophy Substack. What it means is, when you feel the pull toward a fixed position, when you find yourself collapsing into one pole of an argument, defining yourself against the other pole, you notice that, and you zoom out, not to dissolve the tension, but to hold it, to find the larger constellation that both poles are part of. She uses a phrase I keep coming back to. Andrea Hiott says, the paradox is the portal, not the problem. It's something to walk through. And she takes this somewhere surprising. She says, the more you practice this, the more you realize that you yourself are the tension. You're not a fixed point that the tension is happening to. You are the dynamic pattern that the tension constitutes. Andrea Hiott writes, you become strong enough to hold this tension, and in so doing, you access a space that is the tension, which means you no longer feel it, even as you feel it more than ever, remaining committed to what you know as real and true. This is not a passive stance. Structure and freedom are not either or. That last line is worth sitting with. Structure and freedom are not either or. You don't have to choose between having conviction, standing for something real, and having openness, holding things lightly. Those aren't opposites. They're two nodes in a larger constellation, and you can hold both. There's a philosopher she references here, William Blake, the poet and visionary, who spent his whole life writing about what he called the contrarieties, the opposing forces that structure experience. Blake didn't want to resolve them. He wanted to step behind them, like stepping behind a waterfall into the ledge that's always been there, what he called the threshold. a temporary dynamic place of presence where you can see both poles from outside their opposition. Andrea calls this threshold visioning, the practice of hovering in presence at the portal of any choice before you've collapsed into it. Like a hummingbird that stays still but is always in motion, you let the air hold your wings. Andrea Hiott writes in Embracing Paradox and on Love and Philosophy and in Waymaking that paradox is the portal, the threshold from which we vision into further folds. And here's the connection back to our two stories. Buzz Aldrin built his life toward a single point and couldn't survive the shift when the constellation revealed itself. Simone Weil understood the paradox intellectually, but couldn't hold it in herself. She could extend radical care outward, but not turn it inward. Both were living in a version of either or. Both found the ground again, or tried to, only when they moved into something more relational, more bodily, more like what Andrea calls care. Part 5. Bodies are constellations of care, the shift from competition to love. I want to go somewhere bigger now, because everything we've been talking about, the tension, the care, the practice of holding paradox, Andrea grounds all of it in something biological, not metaphorical, biological. In a recent talk, building on work in cognitive science and phenomenology, she offered what I think is the most precise formulation of everything she does. The phrase is, Andrea Hiott writes that bodies, be they cells, individuals, groups, are constellations of care, ambiguous, tense constellations infused with their own uncontainability, transforming constantly so as to survive their own pulsations, and so as to keep that pulsation flowing. Bodies are constellations of care. Start with body. We tend to think of it as a fixed, bounded thing. Your body, your skin is the edge of you. But Andrea, drawing on the philosopher Merleau-Ponty, is pointing at something stranger. A body is a bracketing, a circle we draw around part of an ongoing process in order to understand it. And what we've bracketed was never actually separable from everything outside the bracket. It was always flowing through the boundary we drew. She calls this, in Merleau-Ponty's phrase, bonne ambiguïté. Good ambiguity, positive ambiguity. The body is irreducibly ambiguous, simultaneously subject and object, sensing and sensed, yours and of the world. That ambiguity isn't a flaw. It's what makes experience possible at all. Now add constellations. She's saying something more than we should think in constellations. She's saying that's what you are. Your body, at every scale, from the cells that are constantly dying and regenerating inside you, to the version of you that exists in your relationships, is not a fixed object. It's a dynamic, shifting, relational pattern. And then, care. She draws on the philosopher Jonas, who wrote about life itself as a kind of metabolic tension. Just to stay alive, any living thing must constantly transform itself. Take in, process, release, respond. It is never static. It is permanently in exchange with its environment. Jonas called this a tension between being and non-being, the precarious, needful freedom that constitutes life. Andrea takes this further. That tension isn't just something life has, it's what life is. And what she calls that constitutive tension, that permanent, irresolvable responsiveness to the world around you, is care. Not care as a choice, not care as a feeling, care as the basic condition of being a living body at all. Pause, 2-3 seconds. Here's why this matters so much. We have a dominant story about life, about evolution, about society, about success. And that story is competition, survival of the fittest, zero sum, the strong win. There is truth in that story. Selection is real, conflict is real. Andrea isn't dismissing it, but she's saying the story is incomplete in a way that has consequences. Because if you look at what actually keeps bodies alive, at every scale, it isn't primarily competition. It's responsiveness, dynamic exchange, the ongoing, never finished, fundamentally caring relationship between a body and the world it's moving through. A cell doesn't survive by defeating other cells. It survives by maintaining thousands of simultaneous relationships with its environment, by being, in the deepest sense, constitutively responsive, constitutively caring. The frame changes entirely. You stop asking, how do I win? And you start asking, how do I stay in relation? How do I keep the pulsation flowing? Andrea Hiott says that we are constellations, held together by and as care. And this is the dynamic ground we are here to explore and learn how to handle, because it is painful. Love really is not comfortable, even though it can be experienced as flow. If you are a constellation of care, if that's not a metaphor but a description of what you literally are, then your contradictions aren't problems. They're the tensions that keep you alive. Your ambiguities aren't failures of self-definition. They're the good ambiguity that makes genuine contact with the world possible. And the either-or trap, the pressure to pick a side, to be legible, to collapse into a fixed position, is asking you to stop being alive in the fullest sense. Part 6, the complexity of love, coming back to where we started. Let's come back to the complexity of optics. The atmosphere we described in the cold open. Andrea asks us to imagine it literally as a waterfall. All the noise, the image, the performance, the headlines and thumbnails and metrics, and the way none of it quite lives up to itself. All that flooding around you each day, promising to give you the solution to your discomfort even as it generates more of it. And she says, what if you stepped behind the waterfall? There's a ledge there. There's always been a ledge there. A threshold. A place that is temporary and lasting at once. A place of dynamic pause where you can see the water for what it is without being swept away by it. She calls the alternative to the complexity of optics the complexity of love. And she's clear that this isn't a soft option. It's not choosing warmth over power. It's recognizing that the complexity of optics is actually a confusion about where power comes from. Andrea Hiott. Real power is being able to stand strong and clear with what you want to share, even as your very standing is a movement. A dancing with all you're conversing with. It's knowing why you want to share what you are bringing, and letting it help and empower you. The complexity of love is the web of relations that we actually are. The ripple of every small action through everything it touches. The way a word spoken to a stranger at the grocery store becomes part of how they speak to their child that evening, which becomes part of how that child speaks to a friend, which continues outward in ways no one can track. This is what Andrea means when she talks about care at every scale. Cells to individuals to groups. It's all the same pattern. She quotes the golden rule, which she admits might sound naive at first, especially if you've been flooded with the complexity of optics for a while. But she says, this is not sentimentality. This is the categorical imperative. This is Confucius and Plato and Aristotle and every major philosophical tradition arriving at the same place, because it's what the pattern of life actually requires. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you, understood not as moral instruction, but as a description of how relational systems actually work. The ways we make set up the ways we will be made. The habits we go along with are creating possibilities for us. It really is as simple and as hard as that. And this is where the Varela moment lives, for those who know Andrea's work. In 1973, during the Chilean coup, a neuroscientist named Francisco Varela was hiding from soldiers. He looked at a young soldier coming toward him and realized if they had met 2 months earlier in a bar, they would have been friends. The polarization had turned them into enemies. And in that moment, Varela understood. There is no winning side. There is no single truth. It's all connected, always changing, not one and not two. That's the phrase. Not one, not two. Not the same, not separate. Not the resolution of contradiction, but the holding of it. Closing, the invitation. So, if you're living in the complexity of optics, if you feel the pressure to pick a side, to be legible, to perform a fixed version of yourself, Andrea Hiott is saying that pressure is real, and it's also a confusion. It's confusing the complexity of optics for the complexity of love. It's confusing attention for care. It's confusing the map for the territory. You are not a fixed point. You are a constellation. You are a tense, ambiguous, dynamic process of being alive in the world, and your tensions aren't flaws. They're the evidence that you are constitutively caring, that you are in relation, that you are responsive, that you are alive. The practice she's offering is a practice of noticing that, of catching yourself in the moment of collapsing into a fixed position and zooming out. Not to dissolve what you believe, not to give up standing for what you know is real, but to feel the space around it, to let the constellation reveal itself. Andrea Hiott. Care is the tension. We cannot escape it. though we can create a lot of pain and destruction by trying to believe we can escape it. Source: Care is Tension into a New Dimension, Love and Philosophy Substack. Buzz Aldrin walked on the moon and found it desolate, because he was looking for something care couldn't be replaced by. He found his way back, not by going higher, but by going inward, by writing, by talking to himself, by helping others, by admitting finally how much he needed the ground. Simone Weil had a heart that beat round the world and burned herself out trying to be the source of all care rather than a participant in it. And yet in that moment outside the unemployment office, stripped of achievement and status, standing with strangers in shared need, she called it miraculous. She found it in exactly the place she'd been trying to manufacture it. Not through perfection, not through arriving anywhere, through presence, through care. The paradox is the portal. We are constellations held together by and as care. And the tension, the beautiful, terrible, irresolvable tension of being alive and in relation, is the love. If you want to go deeper into Andrea Hiott's work, find her podcast, Love and Philosophy Beyond Dichotomy, on any podcast app or at loveandphilosophy.com. Her book Holding Paradox is available now in the UK and available for pre-order worldwide. Her research diaries are on Substack at lovephilosophy.substack.com. She is genuinely one of the most careful, warm, and surprising thinkers working today. Start anywhere. Can I ask you something? When someone puts you in a box, are you more of a city person or a nature person? Are you logical or emotional? Are you an optimist or a pessimist? Do you ever feel this tiny moment of resistance? Something that wants to say, actually, I'm kind of both, or neither, or honestly, it's so much more complicated than that. That feeling, that little resistance, that's what today is about. There's a philosopher and neuroscientist named Andrea Hiott who has spent most of her life trying to give that feeling a rigorous, beautiful foundation. Not just as a mood, but as a way of thinking, a way of being in the world. She calls it, among other things, constellation thinking. Her broader project is called Love and Philosophy, Beyond Dichotomy. And that phrase, beyond dichotomy, is worth sitting with from the start, because dichotomy is everywhere. Pick a side. Are you with us or against us? Winning or losing? The pressure to collapse into one pole or the other is relentless. And a lot of us, especially right now, especially if you're young, are exhausted by it. Andrea Hiott says, there is another way, and it's not a compromise. It's not splitting the difference. It's something much more alive than that. Part 1, the either-or trap, and why your brain was never built for it. Let's start with something Andrea is absolutely clear about. The problem with either-or thinking isn't just philosophical, it's neurological. She spent years in neuroscience labs. The Max Planck Institute, the Berlin School of Mind and Brain, Heidelberg, studying the hippocampus. That's the seahorse-shaped structure in your brain known as the cognitive GPS, the brain's navigation system. And what she found is that this structure doesn't work in straight lines. It doesn't store fixed maps. It shifts between reference frames constantly. It holds multiple spatial possibilities at once, even when you're completely still. In other words, your brain is already doing constellation thinking, right now, whether you know it or not. She writes on her website, what I refer to as constellation thinking is a way of discussing cognition and all our philosophies without using dualistic terms. These ideas arise from non-linear cognitive processes, where a focal singularity, such as what we call a thought, is at that same time also a simultaneous network of many related ideas, concepts, and habituated scenarios. A thought arrives as a network, not a single point, a whole sky. And yet, most systems around us reward the opposite. Our schools, our social media, our political conversations. They reward certainty, staying in your lane, a kind of cognitive flatness that feels like strength, but is actually a limitation. She calls it the either-or trap. And escaping it isn't about being wishy-washy or uncommitted. It's about being more honest about the actual complexity of being alive. Part 2, Constellation Thinking. Looking at the night sky with your back to the earth. What does constellation thinking actually feel like from the inside? Andrea has a beautiful way in. In one of her research diaries, these raw, unscripted video entries she records almost like voice memos turned into philosophy. She describes a memory from 5th grade. Her teacher, Dr. Lynch, told her to go outside at night, lie in the grass, look up at the stars, and imagine herself on a round object, the Earth, and then imagine all the stars as round objects too, and then try to hold the whole picture, this tiny her, on this giant Earth, which was just a little dot in this night sky, surrounded by all these other planets and suns. She's been thinking about that image ever since. From that diary, you won't just see random points of light. You might start to see patterns, constellations. We all naturally start to connect the stars, like drawing lines between them, creating meaning from this relationship of all these beautiful points of light, which are remarkably not actually connected in any way like that. They're separated by vast distances, light years of empty space. Some of them maybe aren't even burning anymore. We just still see them. Stars in a constellation aren't close to each other. They might be millions of light years apart. But from where we stand, they form a pattern, a meaningful shape. And that meaning is real, not because any single star created it, but because of the relationship between them. She goes on, holding that tension of being so small and yet part of something so amazing has really stayed with me since I was a kid. And now I'm getting old, but I still think of this image a lot, and it helps me to get out of linear ways of thinking. What makes constellation thinking feel different is this. It catches you when you're about to collapse everything into a judgment. She says, catching yourself when you're judging yourself or judging others in this either-or way. It's either right or it's wrong, it's good or it's bad. It's like being turned around. You're facing the Earth instead of looking at the stars. You're not able to feel the Earth on your back. You're not looking at this constellation that is us. A constellation that is us. Sit with that a second. You are not a fixed point. You are the pattern that emerges from all your experiences, contradictions, relationships, memories, losses, the things that surprised you. That pattern looks different from every angle. And that's not a crisis. That's richness. She also talks about how different cultures look at the exact same sky and see entirely different things. She mentions Aboriginal Australian traditions that navigate not by the stars themselves, but by the dark spaces between them. The absence, not just the light. Same sky, a completely different map. And she says, that space between is actually what's the consistent holding. That says something really crucial about our participation in this. Part 3, Holding, Paradox, the Portal. Here's where it gets most radical and most useful for everyday life. Holding Paradox. Andrea has written a whole book with this title, and she describes it on her website with a precision I love. It is a practice whereby we notice what feels like an either or choice or situation in our lives, and we hold that tension rather than try and make the choice or resolve it. We notice the polarities, and we begin to imagine them not as dual poles, but as two parts we have focused on within a larger constellation. In so doing, we immediately enter a different way of thinking, which is also a different way of being. Notice that shift. You're not choosing between two poles. You're zooming out and realizing that what looked like the whole picture, this or that, right or wrong, me or them, was only two stars in a sky that holds many more. She's very clear this is not passivity. She says it directly. In contrast to such surety, the idea of holding paradox can seem passive, peaceful, wishy-washy. It's not. Holding paradox is the portal into constellation thinking, a way of seeing reality in all its fractal, multi-layered, thrilling messiness. It's feeling and being the light without dissolving into it. This is the challenge of our times. The challenge of our times. She means that literally. She continues. Balancing the light with the fractures of our landscape keeps us from going numb. We feel here, now, alive, in this world, in these challenges. The German word she keeps reaching for is aufheben, Hegel's word, famously impossible to translate, because it means several contradictory things simultaneously: to preserve, to cancel, and to transcend. The word itself demonstrates what it means. She calls this her practice. In Research Diary Number 8, she describes sitting with Hegel's Phenomenology of Spirit, a book she's carried for years, and feeling how it holds the rhythm of holding paradox within it, not as a conclusion, a practice, something you do, something you return to. Think about your own life, something you love that also exhausts you, something you believe in that you keep acting against, someone who means everything to you and also drives you completely up the wall. These aren't failures of consistency. They're paradoxes. And our usual move is to fix them. Pick one side, suppress the other, be consistent. Andrea says, what if instead you held it, stayed in the tension long enough to let it open into something larger? She writes, holding the paradox until it expands beyond the confines that created it. It doesn't get solved. It gets bigger. It opens. And in that opening, something genuinely new becomes visible. She also connects this to something sharper. She talks about the rabbit-duck illusion. That image that looks like a rabbit from one angle and a duck from another. She says, when a person does not know this is possible, that you can hold both at once, they can be taken advantage of by someone who does know this, because that person can switch everything in a move that's becoming common and deliberate and still say, it was there all along. She's talking about manipulation. Binary thinking makes us vulnerable to algorithms, to rhetoric, to anyone who benefits from us seeing only two options. Holding paradox isn't just philosophically interesting. It's a form of protection, of agency. Part 4, From Competition to Care, the Bigger Picture. Everything so far might feel very internal, and it is. But Andrea is clear it doesn't stay there. The same either-or logic that flattens our inner life also structures our societies. Competition over connection, winning over belonging, being right over being present. And she has a phrase for what we lose when that logic dominates. She says we lose our power to care. In her Constellation Thinking Diary, she says, care holds the attachment and the possibility of letting go. It holds the absence and the presence. It's that state I remember as a kid, noticing that I felt the earth behind me in the dark night, and I saw the stars, and I was part of all of this. Just noticing that. That's a kind of step into care. Because then you also notice, maybe I've been talking in a way that's judgmental, even when I care. Maybe I've been acting out of a mindset that sees the world as either or, where you have to fight, where you have to spark controversy just to be seen. She reaches for the philosopher Heidegger, who had a word for care in German, Sorge. That means worry and burden at the same time that it means tending and concern. If you care for something, it can be hard work. It's not always beautiful. And yet, that's exactly where meaning lives. One of the things that comes through in every one of Andrea's conversations is that she's trying to do something quite rare in public life. Bring real care into discourse. Not sentiment, not niceness, real care. The kind that requires you to actually be present, to not already know what you think before the other person finishes speaking. She writes in her kaleidoscopic cognition essay, hating another person or feeling a rush of anger and frustration at their views is not a battle of good and evil, but rather a sign of how different our paths have been. This doesn't mean there is no right or wrong. It just means figuring out what they are will require a bit more work. It will mean sitting with that reaction and letting it be felt, and also letting it pass. And it will require opening to the path of the person in front of us, and trying to do it from a neutral, embodied stance. What could be harder than that? It is truly the work of a lifetime. The work of a lifetime, not a weekend seminar. A practice that never ends because you never fully arrive. Part 5, Why This Matters Now, especially if you're young. I want to speak directly to something. If you're in your 20s or your late teens, you are living in a particular kind of pressure that Andrea's work speaks to directly. You've grown up online. You've grown up in systems that ask you, constantly, structurally, to define yourself. What's your position? What's your identity? What group do you belong to? The algorithm rewards certainty and punishes ambiguity. These aren't neutral forces. They actively shape how you think about yourself. And meanwhile, inside, you might feel like none of the available categories quite fits. Like you're more complicated than any of the identities on offer. Like you love things that are supposed to be in conflict. Like you contain contradictions you're not sure you're allowed to have. Andrea Hiott would say, "You're right, you do." And that is not a problem to fix. That is a life to navigate. She's honest that this can feel destabilizing. She writes with genuine care. Much of what we call mental illness may in fact be related to different levels of overwhelm relative to these multitudes and the ways our bodies sense and align with them. A new way of thinking is also a new way of being. There's no separation. So she's not offering a quick fix. She says, this process is challenging and delicate and can easily spiral. For that reason, it can never be forced. It can only be started when the person starting it is ready for it. To act now, we need infinite patience with yourself, with your contradictions, with the people around you who are also, in their own way, trying to navigate. She also says something worth holding close. There are multiple doors into meaning. We are the keys to one another's doors. We find our rhythm and presence in the flow of one another as we share ways and open doors. It can be as simple as a word spoken to someone at the grocery store, your unique configuration of experiences, the strange turns your life has taken, the things you've loved that don't obviously fit together, the contradictions you carry. That is not baggage. That is your particular position in the constellation. No one else is standing where you're standing, she says. There's no one like you in the world. So you have something to give just by that. You've seen the world differently. You've sensed the world differently. Closing the invitation. Andrea ends a lot of her diaries by not closing things. She leaves them open, leaves you in the question rather than the answer. I want to try that here. What if the exhaustion you feel, the exhaustion of being asked to be simpler, more consistent, more certain than you actually are, what if that's a signal, not a flaw, a signal? That something in you already knows you're more than either or. That something in you is already trying to think in constellations, already trying to hold the paradox, already pushing, maybe quietly, maybe without the right words for it yet, toward care instead of just competition. She talks about Aboriginal cultures that navigate by the dark spaces between the stars, the same sky. A completely different way of finding your way. You don't have to resolve everything today. You just have to stay with it a little longer, hold it, let it expand, and see what opens up. Wherever you are out there, I hope something happens today that gives you a glimpse of that. In whatever language it arrives. You can find the real ideas we used here in the Making Ways pamphlet from Andrea Hiott, called Embracing Paradox, or in the Substack Waymaking, and at www.makingways.com. All copyright of photos is to those places, thanks.